Before this episode begins, we want to give you a trigger warning. We want you to know that the content of this episode speaks to pregnancy loss and miscarriages and/or a viable pregnancy. We understand this content may be triggering to some of you, and you may wish to save this episode for another day. Remember, your emotions are valid, and we encourage you to take care of yourself and reach out to reliable resources for support when you need them.
One thing that really came out of therapy was that I had this vision of what my life was going to be like, and I would not look at anything else. And letting go of that vision was probably the hardest part because I just wouldn't take a different path. It was my worst nightmare not to have children. That felt like the worst thing that could ever happen to me. And it's not.
Hi, superhumans. I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise.
We're two of the physician leaders at Markham Fertility Center, otherwise known as Our Baby, MFC.
As fertility specialists, we've witnessed firsthand the challenges, triumphs, and the myriad of emotions that come with trying to conceive. Whether you're just starting to think about having a baby, actively trying, or facing challenges along the way, My Fertility Podcast will be your go-to resource for honest conversations and a supportive community.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea and settle in, and let's demystify the world of fertility together. Welcome back, superhumans. Joining us today on the show is Carrie. She is the founder of Blooming with Care. Carrie is a freelance writer based in Northern California. Her expertise is in writing about infertility and the many tangents that radiate from her experience. Her trademark is vulnerable and authentic writing. You can connect with Carrie on Instagram at Blooming with Care. Today, Carrie talks candidly about her long journey with infertility and how she and her partner have found peace and are now happy, child-free after infertility. Thank you, Carrie, for being with us today. I have to tell you, I am so excited for this interview. I have been following you on Instagram for a while. And of course, Instagram is full of content. But every time I come across a post from you, I stop, I take a big breath, and I really listen because your content, even though I'm a fertility specialist and my job is to help people pregnant, the way that you speak about grief and loss and about finding peace after your fertility journey really speaks to me in a very deep level. So thank you so much for being here. I like to think about all the patients out there that I wasn't able to help, and I hope that they find you. And I hope that through this interview, we are able to talk about something that not many people talk about. And I think, regardless of where your journey ends, everybody needs to, at some point, have that moment where they ask themselves that question, what if it doesn't work? What do I do next? And I know when I was going through my journey, I had to ask myself that question. And there weren't any accounts like yours out there that I can listen to. So thank you so much for being so vulnerable and putting that work out there and for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. That was quite an intro, so I appreciate that.
So tell us who you are. Tell us what you're doing out in the world. Tell us about your journey and what led you to be you today.
So I had just like a regular Instagram account for many years. And then in 2014, my husband and I got married and we decided to start trying for kids right away. And I had seen like a few accounts somewhat online at that time and was like, oh, I'll start tracking my kind of fertility journey. But I did it very privately at first because it felt very vulnerable. And we tried naturally for 5 years. And I kind of refused to even admit that there was an issue. I just kept thinking it was going to happen. And I lived in that loop for a very long time. And it was very stressful. I turned to very unhealthy like coping mechanisms. I lost a lot of relationships in my life because I was absolutely drowning and really not willing to admit it. And then after 5 years, we finally got brave enough to see a doctor and we became great candidates for IVF and we jumped right into it. The first round, we got pregnant. I had a miscarriage at about 8 weeks. And then within a month, we went right back into it again. And I got pregnant again. And I carried my daughter for 8 months but I developed a rare liver disease called cholestasis of pregnancy, which I had never heard of. And I didn't think it was a big deal. My doctors were like, there's medication, everything's fine. Unfortunately, it did end up taking my daughter's life, and I delivered her stillborn in May of 2017, which drastically changed literally everything. And we still had frozen embryos. So we explored the idea of surrogacy. I was told I should probably never be pregnant again for how fast and how intense my cholestasis came on. And honestly, that was a relief because I felt like, oh my gosh, I can stop worrying about it now and I can bring in others to help. And we had multiple people step up to be our surrogate. And I was able to connect with an old childhood friend through Instagram. We were following each other, and I had been sharing my story. And she and I reconnected, and she was a great candidate. And we did the first round of IVF with her, and she got pregnant and had a miscarriage. And then we did another one, and she had a miscarriage. And after that second miscarriage with our surrogate, I was pretty exhausted. It was almost 10 years at that point. I was just really tired. We did look into adoption, and the way that it works where I live, it didn't seem like a really stable thing for us to get into. I was very nervous about having a baby taken away from me, and ultimately decided to embrace the child-free life with a lot of therapy. I want to stress that. There was a lot of therapy at that point.
Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't like a one moment be like, oh, well,
Nope.
plan B. I'm sure it wasn't like
Yes.
that. Yeah.
And I've been very open about it, and I have connected with so many wonderful people throughout this journey because of that. And I feel like me sharing has been a gift to myself. I absolutely love it. It's drastically changed my life.
And definitely a gift to others. When you're a fertility specialist, there's so many incredible moments that you get to share with your patients. And one of the ones that I remember is this patient that was actually not my patient. She was a patient of the doctor that retired when I took over, and she had done so many things. And looking over her thick file, going over the things, and now she's becoming my patient, and I'm getting ready to have some sort of plan that, I mean, I don't know what plan because she's done all the things. And she comes in and she sits down and she says, Dr. Garcia, I'm here to tell you that I'm done. I don't want to do anything else. I'm going to move on to be child free. Can
wow.
you help me with resources? And I was not prepared for that. My jaw dropped. I stare at her and I was like, I don't know. I said, I don't know, but I will find out. So I actually posted on Instagram. Some people got me to your account, and then I sent it to her. And that's how I ended up actually learning about your account. And then I kept following you. And I tell you, out of all the content on Instagram, I really stopped and listened to yours
Oh, thank
because
you.
it is so. And every time you make a post, I go like, wow, like she's doing that, like the fact that you can talk about these things and you're very honest. You're not like, hey, this is so great. Look at me having fun, sleeping in every day. Like that's not what you're about. You're really talking about how hard it is and the triggers and thinking and the doubts and all the moments in between. So yeah, thank you for doing that.
Thank you for sharing my account as well, because getting into the IVF world, there was tons of resources for that. And then when it was like, okay, we're maybe thinking about not having children, I only found like 2 accounts. And I'm friends with them today because I was like, hello, can you help me?
As you mentioned, there really is not a lot in this space for patients who are thinking about stopping fertility treatments or taking an extended break from fertility treatments. So, if there are people who are sort of thinking about these things, where would you suggest that they go? I mean, obviously, your account is fantastic and incredible, but are there other resources out there or other thought processes, or how did you kind of start to tackle that question?
I love variety, so that I love this question.
Mhm.
One of the biggest accounts for me was, oh gosh, her name is Katie.
Oh, yes, the account is the Childless Collective.
Yes, because she changed it, and she has helped take over Gateway Women, which was a very big resource for me with Jody Day. And there's like a very active community that speaks together. They have online events a lot. And meeting with Katie changed my life. Like I was like, oh my God, there's someone my age-ish that seems pretty happy with her choice. So that was a big one. And she has like an app where you can join, and there's weekly chats, daily chats. And that was very helpful for me. And she has a ton of resources. I feel like I share a lot of my story, but she has a lot of resources.
And I have a question for you, Carrie. On that journey of making that decision to be child-free and happy, did you and your partner come in at it together? Because I could see a situation when one partner says, I'm done, and the other one says, no, I'm not. Can you talk about that?
This has been a really wonderful thing about our relationship that absolutely made us closer. I was just talking to my husband the other day where I was like, I feel like we've never been on the same page, but we're in the same chapter of a book. And he was like, I actually think we're in different books. And I was like, okay. And he was like, and that's not a bad thing. We were really talking about how we are two different humans experiencing this really intense experience. And we're absolutely seeing it from different perspectives, from different viewpoints. And I'm a talker. He's not as much, but he will if I'm like, okay, I would like to sit down and chat with you. And one thing that's really worked for us is a lot of time, like if I want to talk about something big, I'll say, okay, tomorrow I would like to talk about adoption. And so we have like 24 hours to kind of wrap our heads around it. Probably more so for him because I can just jump right into that and I will have things to say and facts and ideas and tips. And he's like, I kind of need to sit with it. And at first that was like, well, why can't you just talk about it right now? And he was like, I have to process this. And so I think learning how we communicate with each other has been very helpful. But we always had these boundaries. Like we were never going to do IVF. And then we absolutely did IVF. So that we never thought we'd have like work with a surrogate. And when we were looking into adoption, he had a lot of feelings about it. And he was like, I don't know if this is what I want to do. But we met with an adoption placement person who happened to also be my therapist. So that was a very nice segue for us. And through that together, we were like, oh, I don't think this is for us. But I think one of the main things was just being very open, but also acknowledging that we don't have to be in the same exact space as long as we're both supporting each other. And I even remember when I came home from finding out that our surrogate had had the second miscarriage, I was like, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. And my husband was like, well, we've put up these boundaries before. Are you sure? I don't want to just close that door. Let's leave it open a bit because we've never actually followed through with a boundary that we've put up. We've talked about it. And I said, no, I think this is it. And he the whole time had always said, I think we could just be happy with the two of us. I was like, I don't think I could. Around that time, I knew I had to choose myself. And I was tired of choosing this path that continually made me really, really sad. And so he was like, okay, let's talk about it. And we went to therapy. I think it's important to note that you don't have to be in the same book. You can still be in different places and still be very supportive and communicative together while still loving the future.
That's great. That's a really good tip. I'm going to use it with my husband because I think he's kind of like that. I'm going to do the let's talk about it tomorrow thing.
Yes.
I tend to be like you, like, sit down now and tell me.
I've been thinking about this.
One thing that you mentioned is that you guys went to lots of therapy and the therapy was super helpful. Can we talk a little bit about that? I don't think people talk about it as much in terms of how much therapy, people are doing that it helps people to get to these things, whether it's therapy on your own, couples therapy, finding a new therapist, and how much work it really is and how much effort that it is. And so can you give us an idea of the scope of the therapy that you've done to sort of give patients or people who are listening to this an idea of what it takes and what that looks like?
I love therapy. I've been going to therapy since I've been like 15, on and off my whole life. So it is a tool that I'll pick up every now and then. And I wouldn't see a therapist for a very long time dealing with infertility because again, I was like, well, it's just going to happen. It'll be fine. I don't need to talk about it with somebody.
I hear that a lot.
Right? I mean, because you're just relying on that next cycle to work. So it's like, oh, there's a boundary there and I'll get it. I'll hit it. And I remember I joined virtual support groups because that felt very safe. Like I didn't have to speak or I could turn my camera off. And I just wanted to hear other people dealing with the same thing that I was dealing with. And then I got brave and would like turn my camera on and I would start sharing. And then I realized that I wanted in person. And I found a local support group, which was kind of a slippery slope because everybody in the support group got pregnant. And I was like, oh, okay, so like it's just me. And I felt othered, even though they were very supportive, but it was just like, oh, well, everybody's getting it. Where I live, one of the better Northern California clinics is like an hour and a half away. And we were all seeing the same doctor. We were all going to the same place. So it felt very, oh, we're all dealing with the same thing, except it was like, except everybody's getting pregnant. And I'm like, I am not. So a therapist came to that support group and she specializes in infertility. And she came to speak and she happened to be local. And I immediately was like, I need a card. And I reached out to her right away. And she had gone to the same doctor. And so again, we had those connections. And I started going to her weekly for a few years. And my husband came a couple of times. He was like, I don't necessarily feel like I need it the way you do, which was fine. He came when we talked about adoption, and she was very good at asking all the hard questions. And I think that was one thing for me, because when I went to see her and she said, what do you want out of this? And I knew that, I think a big thing for me was I knew what I wanted. I needed permission for things, and I wanted to help figure out if I wanted kids or not. And so she was able to kind of like focus in on that. Also, she said if I didn't know what I wanted, we could explore that. But I was like, I'm pretty decisive. I know what I'm feeling. And then after my daughter died, we went to grief counseling because I knew we were going to need help with that. And so, but that didn't last very long. We went to a grief counselor that specialized with grief. And then we were able to go back to my regular therapist. I think that she just brought up a lot of questions. And a lot of people will say like, oh, I don't know if I have access to a fertility specialist therapist, which I acknowledge. But it was very helpful because she had been through it. She knew. I felt so seen, more so ever by a therapist than I ever have, because she knew exactly what I had been through. And she had kids, but via IVF. So it was still very comfortable in that way.
I wonder, Carrie, if you can speak to what it's like in your day to day. I'm sure that you run into people that go like, oh, but you could adopt. Oh, but how about you have this tea? Or, don't give up. Things can happen. Miracles happen. I'm sure you have those conversations. I get shivers just thinking about that. So how do you handle those with grace without punching somebody in the face?
Great question. So we're like 4 years out of deciding not to have children. So I feel like I've had a lot of practice with it. I think one of the biggest things for me is always expecting it. And if it doesn't happen, it's a very pleasant surprise. But most of the time it happens. And it still will absolutely trigger me, and I will feel the fire in me. Through a lot of therapy, I have come to just think they're trying to do this with love. They think they're helping. I think it's a lot harder, I'll be honest, on social media for me because I'm not face to face, because rarely do people say the terrible things face to face. They still say things like, you can just adopt. I usually just say it didn't work out for us. And most people get that. Or if they say, do you have kids? Just that simple question, very small talk question. I kind of like to gauge of where I'm at because it changes day to day. And often I'm not going to tell Susie in line my whole story at the grocery store. But if it's somebody that I'm meeting and I think that I might want to have a relationship with, I often bring it up pretty quickly. Oh, we tried, it didn't work out. We did A, B, C, and D. But I think the biggest thing is that I practice a narrative a lot before I go somewhere new, or if I'm seeing family I haven't seen in a long time. And I think like, how am I feeling today? Do I want to get into it? Do I not want to get into it? And while I like to think that these people are trying to help me, because I genuinely think that they are, like, oh, have you tried this herb? I did try it. Usually when I say it didn't work out, people will often stop because it's not an inviting conversation, right? That's not an inviting response of, oh, I want to talk about everything. So I practice a lot. Like I'll practice in the mirror, literally saying it out loud to my face and seeing what feels. Do I say, no, I just don't have kids? We were at a work dinner, one of my husband's work dinners, and somebody asked, and I said, oh, I don't want kids. And the look on my husband's face was like, and I'd never said that before, but I was like, just trying it out because I don't want kids anymore. Like we're actively not trying. And we were leaving and he was like, I can't believe you just said that. And I was like, well, we don't want kids, right? He was like, right, but we tried. We did try it. And I was like, we did, but I don't like want to have the conversation at your dinner table. And that was when it came out where we talked about like, well, we're not in the same place. He's like, well, I think I'm going to keep saying that we did try it. And I was like, that sounds great. I love that for you. We've also talked a lot about how he doesn't get asked as much as I do. So I've had so much more practice in responding to it. So I think it depends on the day.
Yeah, that is a very honest response. And again, one of the things that you're really good at sharing in your account is that it's not all rainbows and daisies,
No.
right? It's not like you're there every day being like, I'm healed, I'm over it, I'm enjoying my life, I don't think about it, this is wonderful. That's not what you're saying. What you're saying is that this is hard and this is a journey, and some days are good and some days aren't, but it's a journey that I choose to be on every day. But it doesn't mean that it's great every day or that
Absolutely.
you navigate it perfectly every day.
I just met somebody this weekend where I was at a bachelorette party, an overnight event. So like I knew I was going to be with these women for a while. And I have a clementine tattoo. And it gets asked about every now and then. Normally I don't say much, but this woman and I were really bonding. And she's like, oh, what's that? And I said, oh, I'm going to tell you something, but I might cry and it's really sad, but it's also okay. And she was like, whoa. And I told her my whole story. And she was like, I can't believe you just said that. And I was like, well, I like you. I think that I would maybe want a relationship with you.
Oh, that's so honest. I think that anytime somebody is being so honest and vulnerable in such a real way on social media, it's so refreshing, which is kind of sad in its own way that honesty is suddenly so fresh and new. But that honesty and that vulnerability on social media, I think, is so unique. And when people are being their true self, their authentic self, and presenting that to the world, you can tell, and people empathize with that automatically and feel that so deeply. Whether patients or people are going through the same fertility journey or a different fertility journey or whatever, even just that question of, hey, do you have kids? That is so, dare I say, triggering for lots of people.
Absolutely.
Not just necessarily people who are opting to live child free. You know, people are going through their fertility journeys, people who've had miscarriages, etc. And I think that those things resonate so much. And I think that's what really shines through on your social media, and it makes it really like a breath of fresh air
Thank
in
you.
the Instagram world of everyone being all
Right.
perfect and baking their own bread all day long.
I saw something recently that was like, I live my life in a trial and error. I just didn't realize there would be so much error. And I felt that to my core. I was like, yes.
Great.
So, I mean, let's say someone is listening to this and they are maybe starting to toy with the idea and they're having these thoughts about maybe not continuing their fertility journey, right? Thinking about other things. Maybe it's just in their mind. They haven't spoken to their partner if they have a partner, but it's starting to form. What suggestions would you have? How do you even start working through that thought?
I think that the way you even said like that you don't even say it, but it's there. I remember that and really shoving that down and being like, nope, we're not exploring that. But it came up a lot. I mean, like I said, we tried for 8 years. So it floated around because I think that I still would have tried all the things that I did. I don't think that I would have done something differently. But maybe if I would have just turned that on, just explored it just a little bit more, and not even saying that I was going to take a break or stop, but just wondered what that looked like. Because one thing that really came out of therapy was that I had this vision of what my life was going to be like, and I would not look at anything else. And letting go of that vision was probably the hardest part because I just wouldn't take a different path. I think just kind of even exploring, well, what would it be? What could we do? And even in just the beginning of, oh, we could spend our money differently. We could save differently, making it kind of look kind of prettier than it is in the beginning, just to see it in this idealized way. It was my worst nightmare not to have children. That felt like the worst thing that could ever happen to me. And it's not, but I couldn't unsee that. And I think exploring, talking about it with your partner, just bringing it up and even being like, hypothetically, like just pretend depending on where the two of you are. And again, I know I keep coming back to this, but therapy, my therapist would ask me, what would your life be like? And I was like, well, I don't want to talk about that. And she's like, well, that's why you're here. And like literally coming up with crazy ideas of, okay, well, maybe we could move to a different country and work there. And that's probably not what we're going to do, but we could in a lot easier fashion than we could if we had children. And so like kind of dreaming these like really big, feeling very outrageous ideas and kind of playing in that felt good. Like it was like, oh, I have these options I never really thought about.
So let me ask you a question, Carrie, because it is something that I personally struggle. So let me tell you a little bit about my story. I also had my children through IVF. I have two boys, and the first one was a couple of cycles, but I did conceive with him, and I never really had to explore the what if because it happened fairly early in my journey. But for the second one, I did have to go there. I was 39, 40 by the time I conceived him. There were lots of things, miscarriages and whatnot that happened. And I had to really say, am I going to be able to have a second child or not? So I had to take a moment to explore what life would be like with an only child. I even bought a book called An Only Child.
Yes.
I read one page and then threw it because I couldn't handle it. But I did have to explore that quite a bit. And in speaking with a lot of my other patients, even on this podcast, we've done these interviews where they've been successful, but they've talked also about having had that moment where they had to stop and think, this might actually not work. What would my life look like? And I think anyone in the fertility journey at some point may want to consider that, because even if it is successful, I'll tell you, for me, I explored that and then I decided if it doesn't work, this is what it's going to be like. And I'm going to do all the work to get there. Then I decided to go back one last cycle. And I do have my son now. But then later on in other situations, like for example, Dr. Weiss and I are the owners of Market Fertility Center, but there was a time that we didn't know that we could do that. And I remember at that time thinking, oh, I have now the skill of saying, this is the vision that I have. But if it doesn't work, what is it going to look like? And can I have a different vision? So I actually did the work again of letting go of one thing to look at the other thing. And then once I was able to say, I'm going to be happy no matter what, I could go back to the first thing and go at it like all force, knowing that my life didn't depend on it. It's something that I wanted, but my life didn't depend on it. That ability of saying, I want this really badly and I'm going to do what it takes, but my life doesn't depend on it. And I have a life that I can live no matter what. And I am worthy of love no matter what. And I am worthy of a wonderful, beautiful life no matter what. And I know how to create that life no matter what. I think that's really powerful.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, you gave me chills because that is a muscle we have to practice, because no one's life is turning out the way that
No,
they planned. Like
no.
that isn't how it works. And infertility or not, something is going to come into your life and it's going to be like, oh, this isn't what I expected. This isn't how I want to do it. And for me, I didn't have a lot of that experience before. Like I got into college, I got the job I wanted, I found the man I wanted to marry, and it was like, oh, I'm checking off all the boxes. This is how I saw it. And it's hard to be like, oh, it's not going to work out. Like that is a very practiced skill that young Carrie did not have.
Knowing what I know now, I still struggle with how to convey that to patients. Because of course, I'm the cheerleader. I'm the person who's working hard for them, and I will continue to work hard for them. And if they want to keep going, I mean, the options are endless. There's like donor, surrogates, whatnot. So it's never up to me to say we should stop. I never say that. I always say, here are the next options. But I also really do want them to know that they can stop if they want to, that as their doctor, I'm going to be as encouraging of their journey like yours, how it was if they wanted to continue to try to conceive. I struggle with being the cheerleader for the fertility journey. And also I get it emotionally, but I don't know if when I am saying it to people, when I'm talking about it to people, it's coming across the right way, and it's not coming across as, hey, my doctor's giving up on me. That's the one thing. But another thing I wanted to ask you is also another struggle that I personally have is this narrative. And I am part of it. I always tell my patients, I tell the whole world my patients are the strongest people ever because of what they do to conceive. And there's this narrative that when you go through fertility journey, you're strong, you're brave, You are a warrior. You are so worth it of admiration because of all the things that you're willing to do and put your body through in search of this goal to have a child.
Mhm. You're
So
worthy
then
because
when
you keep going.
Right. So then when we stop, what then? Right? Like, how do we switch that narrative? And I think stopping requires a tremendous amount of strength. And this is why, like I said, I pause on your post all the time. I think the ability to stop and say, I'm worthy of a life with or without a child requires a tremendous amount of strength and is so worthy of admiration as well. But we don't have that same narrative for people that quote unquote quit. What would you say about that? Because I personally want to be a cheerleader for both camps.
Right. Somebody recently said to me, "Oh, well, you didn't choose to be child free. You had to." And I said, "I could have kept going. And I know me, like I could have done it. I could have had the kid. Maybe I'd still be trying, but I feel like I could have done it." But there was a moment where I was like, "No, I'm choosing myself." And I had to evaluate my life. Like I literally made a pros and cons list. I love a list, and was like, "Oh boy, like these sad things are real heavy right now." And there wasn't a lot of good happening in my life. And I felt like I get this one life. I would like to live it to my fullest. I tried it, and kudos for trying multiple avenues. But I think a big part of it for me was that I didn't have anything outside of my fertility that was for me. My fertility was the only thing for me. And then I thought my baby was going to be my only purpose. And I kind of started to understand that I needed something else outside of that, especially with a surrogate. It literally was not my body. So I started to have other things in my life that brought me joy. And that was still my main focus. But I quit my job because I was a teacher for 10 years and it was so stressful. And I was like, I don't want to be stressed. So I quit that and I started writing. And that has always been a dream of mine. And I was like, well, it's kind of now or never. I can do it when I'm older, but why not start now? And then I thought I could write about my experience and my journey. And that's what I've been doing. So I think a big part of it is like having something else, but also it's just so individual of how we all come to these conclusions with ourselves. And mine was I was physically ill. I was sick all of the time and I was undiagnosed, but I was depressed. I was diagnosed with anxiety. And like all of these other factors in my life started to just weigh it out. I mean, I tell people just write a list. What's good and what's not good. Be genuine because in the early years, I was like absolutely lying, being like, oh, this is good in my life. Was that good? I was just trying to keep that narrative of I'm going to be a mom, so it's going to be fine. And I think that with another thing for me was the purpose of what am I outside of being a mother, which was not something I wanted to explore and still feels weird sometimes. I lead with I'm a writer, and that is always, like I said, a dream I've wanted. I just always assumed it would be I'm a mother who also writes or something like that. And so I don't know what it's like to be on the doctor's perspective because everyone is so individual. And of course, you're like, I'm trying to help you fulfill this lifelong dream. I loved my fertility doctors. Like they were so great, but there was no discussion of it. I remember after we delivered my daughter stillborn, I don't know how they knew. It was such a blurry time in my life, but I remember the doctor called and was like, I'm so sorry this happened. Cause like we graduated from the clinic. I hadn't spoken to her in months. And she was like, I'm so sorry. And her only really conversation was, well, what are you going to do next? We can get your surrogate in here. And I was like, I don't know how to have this conversation right now. And she was very kind. And I tried to be kind too. And I'm still happy. But there wasn't discussion of, well, are you not going to do this? Like, are you going to be child free? That was never a topic of discussion. So I think even just somehow bringing it up, putting it on the table.
I think having this podcast episode is going to be one way that we're going to try and put this quote unquote on the table. And you're right. That's often a strategy that I use. It's sort of like, well, some patients might consider this, or other patients might explore this, or IUI is up there. IVF is, you can do donor egg, you can do donor sperm, you can do surrogacy, you can do child free live. That's how I try and bring it up in the conversation in a non-judgmental, equally weighted way, and then we can explore what people want to talk about. But I completely appreciate people who don't want to hear about that. You've talked a lot about yourself going through therapy, your relationship with your partner, the social construct of being a woman and sort of how we've been raised by society, there's a lot around being a mother and being selfless and helping and nurturing and all these other things. But you said that you chose yourself, which sadly feels controversial or feels
Absolutely.
unique, right? It's like, oh, like it's something that very few women actually say out loud, I think, maybe more so now. But you did that and you got through that and with your partner. Were there other people in your life who found that difficult or who struggled with your decision? So I'm thinking about the parents, right, who are wanting to be the grandparents and that pressure and how that came into them and how you addressed that. Were there people in your life who really struggled with this?
Yes. Many people still do in my life, and I will say over and over to myself, that's more about them than it is about me, and I have to, like, really dive into that. My mother and I are very close. I am my mother's only biological child, and she didn't even want children. She likes to say I was a surprise, not a mistake. I wanted to make my mom a grandmother. Like, I
Mm.
can only imagine the wonders that we would have all experienced together. And I felt like I was letting her down. I genuinely did. And I remember having that conversation with her, and she was like, "That's not what I want you to feel." And I was like, "I know, but I'm feeling it." And it was more about me than it was about her. And of course, she wanted grandchildren, but she was also like, "I'm super happy with just us, you know?" And, my dad and I, we're not as close. We're still very close. My mom and I speak almost every day. And I remember my dad having, and they're no longer together, so they don't speak. But I remember my dad saying once, "I can't wait to be a grandpa." And that is a very emotional thing that my dad doesn't always tap into. And I was very scared to tell him that we decided to stop. I just knew they were going to love me no matter what. But I really had to work with that fear of I might be letting people down, even though they would not put it in those words. But I absolutely felt that way. And that's okay. I can let people down, but I'm not letting myself down. And that's something that I will tell myself so many times to make it okay. And my mother is very strong and goes against the grain and does her own thing. So I feel like I've been raised in that kind of environment. And I was able to kind of like, well, my mom did stuff that wasn't always like welcomed in her era of life. So I can do that too. A really big part was friendships. I lost multiple friendships through this of people being like, "Oh, well, you could never understand because you don't have kids." And it's like, that is one of the meanest things anyone's ever said to me.
Mhm. Yeah. I was gonna
Um,
ask you about that. Yeah.
and like the friendships part, that was one of the initial reasons why I started going to therapy was because all my friends were getting pregnant and I felt jealous and left behind. And that felt very gross for myself. And then a lot through therapy was like, that's a really normal response to what's happening. It's okay to be jealous. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, but I thought I was. And I had some friends that were like, we couldn't get on the same page. We couldn't get the same book anymore. And we are still no longer friends today. And I think that that happens throughout life, but it hadn't happened to me until infertility. And so I was like, well, it's because I'm not a mother. And if I have a kid, like we'll all be friends again. And showing up for my friends was really hard. I had this specific group that I am no longer in because of the things they would say to me like this. Well, you have to show up for a friend because she's pregnant. We can't talk about your fertility right now. Oh, so I have to be quiet, which I'm never really comfortable with. And I was shoving so much down, trying to not let other people down, that I turned to drugs and alcohol. I became super anxious. And it was like, clearly something is not aligning in my life.
Even outside of infertility, I'm 47 now, and I was talking to Dr. Weiss the other day and saying I'm about to be 50, and the next decade of my life is going to be about me for the first time in 50 years, you know?
Mhm.
We just had that conversation a little while ago. I think that can apply to any aspect of your life.
Yes.
You know, last night I wanted to eat healthy. My whole family was over. They all wanted to order in. And I actually was standing in the kitchen and everybody wants to eat foods I didn't want to eat. And I had to tell myself, do not let yourself down. Do not let yourself down. Took out my phone, ordered for everybody and when I make my salad and ate it with everybody, but I ate what I wanted to eat. It's a muscle that it takes to constantly put yourself first because we're not conditioned to do that. And that simple act of still paying for everybody's food by eating what I wanted to eat, that took me so much because we're not used to, as women, we're not used to putting ourselves first and doing what we actually want to do. We're so used to bringing comfort and nurturing and going with the flow. But yeah, it's something that everybody needs to do regardless of infertility. But certainly fertility forces you to learn that lesson because it's a matter of survival. It's a matter of survival.
Along those lines, let's say you are someone who is a fertile myrtle and you have a friend who is struggling with fertility or is thinking about child-free living or who doesn't have kids and they want to support, right? What can they do? How can they talk about things? How can they approach things, right? Should they not talk about their kids? Is it better to be invited to the baby shower? Better not to be invited to the baby shower? These are tricky things to navigate.
They are. They do want to. And it's such a weird balance that I'd never done before. And I still have friends that have kids that when we were dealing with our infertility. And so, like, it does work out sometimes. And I specifically remember one friend, we were talking about adoption. And she was like, well, it won't really be your kid. And I was like, oh, and I remember I was at work and I was like, I have to go. I just hung up the phone. I can't. And she called me later the day and was like, I'm sorry. I just thought that that was the reality of it. And I was like, no, I get where you're coming from. But as someone who might take that route, that's a really harsh thing to say. And she said, okay, can you tell me all the things I shouldn't say? And I was like, no, because I don't know what they are. But just the fact that she went out on a limb to say that and apologize. And I think she even wrote me a card in the mail and was like, I'm still feeling terrible about this. We're still friends today because she and I put in the work. And the other friends that it didn't work out, we also had other issues. This wasn't the only issue. It was just the cherry on top of the cake. And I think the openness and checking in of, hey, can I talk about this? It's okay if not, which usually it was when they would do that. It was like, thank you for acknowledging that it might not be okay. Also, always invite us to the things. We can say no. I always think about Winnie the Pooh and Eeyore. They always would bring him along and they never expected him to be happy. He was just gloomy Eeyore and they were still themselves and he was always included. And I can say no, but it hurts more when you're like, oh, well, I'm making the choice for you by not inviting you.
That's
and
right.
It's like, oh, you're deciding my life at the moment, which feels very uncomfortable.
Right. When you see it and you're able to come back to that friend and say, I'm really sorry, I'm learning, I'm here for you. I think that makes a big difference. We're not perfect, no one is. And of course, people who don't have fertility problem have no idea what it's like. Just like I have no idea of so many other things because it's not my reality.
Yeah. The friendship, it was a hard thing for me to navigate. I feel like the hardest because I felt like I was being so left behind.
So tell me, you mentioned that there is a book coming out. Are you allowed to talk about it?
Yes, I am allowed to talk about it. I wrote a memoir about my journey with fertility and then embracing the child-free life after. I don't have a title yet, but I like to summarize it up as I have a sad story. I don't have a sad life.
Oh, I love it.
And I think that we all could feel that in some way. But I recently just got into an MFA program for writing, and I'm taking my book to that to hopefully workshop it with other people. Thank you. I'm so excited. I never thought this would be something I would do with a master's in this, but I have the space for it, and it feels very fun. I start right in the beginning of my infertility, and I end in with us really loving our life. It's been interesting. I've been working with an editor and, she's like, well, we got to build up the beginning parts of like why you wanted to be a mother, which was such a weird question to ask for me to explore that and dive into that. That was interesting. But I was like, well, I want to put somewhere in the book, maybe an epilogue of just so you know, I don't get the miracle because I want to make that very clear. I read a lot. And when you read those books and then the end, they're like, and she had the miracle baby. It's like, oh, and there it is. I'm no longer represented in this, I feel. And I really want to put that out that it's not the miracle baby, but it's been so fun to write. It's been very difficult. It's been very rewarding. And we'll see what happens in the next couple of years with it.
I'm excited to see it come out into the world.
And when it does come out, please let us know. We'd be so happy to promote it in some way. It's a book that the world needs, right?
Yes, I like to think so. It's a memoir, but I'm definitely writing it sort of like a novel because I want there to be a story and yeah.
Carrie, just as we're coming to the end of this episode, are there any parting words that you have for anyone listening?
I know I keep coming back to this, but therapy has changed my life in so many ways and in so many different parts of my life, not just with fertility and child free, but there's just something very wonderful about having an outside perspective. I remember after I delivered my daughter stillborn, going to the grief counselor, and she had asked my husband and I, when was the last time you had a fight? Just because she'd never met us, she wanted to kind of like get a feel for us. And we both burst into laughter because it was a silly fight. It was like one of our only fights we've ever had. And she was like, I just want to stop you right now. Like, you just delivered your daughter stillborn, and I asked you about a fight, and you both started laughing. And she said, I think you're both going to be okay. And I was like, oh my God, somebody certified told us we're going to be okay. Like, I think about that a lot when I'm struggling. I'm like, well, someone really that knows the brain and how we function said I was going to be fine. So I'm going to lean into that. So therapy has been a very big help because I just never talked about the hard parts for so long, and having a space to talk about that, even if you're not talking about it with your friend or even your spouse or your family member or somebody, just to have a space to get something out, I think is key, and you kind of work things out. And then I also think that having something outside of your fertility that has something to do that fulfills you, that feels purposeful, I think is very key. I do a lot of art. Even if you're creating something that has to do with your fertility, you're still doing something outside of it. And having something tangible, specifically for me, was very helpful, especially because when we decided to not have children, I felt like, oh, I couldn't hope for things anymore. I put in all this work and I never came out with what I wanted. And so having something else in my life where I can create something and see a finished product was very therapeutic and helpful. Writing has been a big part of that. And being able to see like, oh, I can put in the work and it will end in the way that I want it. Even if it's like a recipe or something super basic, but that idea of hoping for something with my brain really struggled, and I had to remind myself that it can happen.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Carrie. Like I said, I was looking forward to this episode and you did not disappoint. You are just as real and as vulnerable in person. I mean, quote in person, we're meeting virtually as you are on your Instagram account. So thank you so much. I will keep following you and connecting with you over Instagram. And like I said, I really mean it. I pause, I take a breath, and then I'm like, I'm going to read Carrie's words now. I need a moment for this.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
And thanks so much for just being real on social media and laying it out there, the pretty parts and the not so pretty parts. Because when people are looking at social media, it can be very overwhelming.
Yeah.
And we all know the negative side effects of social media sometimes. But your account brings that realness and that breath of fresh air, which is really important for patients. Thank you for being genuine and for being you. And people will connect with that. And I'm sure that many more patients are going to find your account as a result of this, as a result of cross-posting, whatever. And I think that you're providing an important service, frankly. Keep doing what you're doing, please.
Thank you.
It's accounts like yours that really make me a better doctor.
Oh,
I really mean that because it's giving me the language to speak to patients about it, something that I thought about it and I experienced personally, but I didn't really know how to put it out into the world and how to talk about it. So, yeah.
Thank you. Well, that's a great start to my day. Wow.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast or visit us online at markandfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss. Music from Mix Kit Raising Me Higher by Ajay Stelino. My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.